Hi, welcome to the 76 House. My name is Robb Norden. I've been the Tavernkeeper here for over 30 years. There's a lot of history that happened in this great old American building. It's the jewel of Rockland County's very historical past. As far as the Revolution goes, there's probably no landmark that more condensed history happened in. This is our Andre room, which is actually the modern edition. It's only 200 years old. But as we move forward through the building, our front room dates back almost 400 years. This is our original tavern bar rail. It dates back to about 1640 to 1686. In 1686, Tappan got its patent. There were 13 families who gathered, and the land grant, which eventually formed the town of Orangetown, named after the Dutch House of Orange, was formed, and the Maybe House was the public house for this early settlement. And that's important because these Dutch town fathers were naturally predisposed to want to break away from the English. They gathered in our front dining room and signed the first separationless document, which is known as the Orangetown Resolutions. So important was this building to the founding of America that Washington used this edifice many, many times. And we have, in fact, an ale that he enjoyed so much that Casparus Maybe, the original tavern keeper, gave him the recipe, and he produced it in his home in Mount Vernon and so on. And we produce it today with hops, barley, and every ingredient that goes into this is grown within 30 miles of this tavern. It's not carbonated, it's made for us by Tom's River Brewing, and we use our old beer engine to pull it. So this is as authentic an American tavern ale as you can get, and it's precisely what we served here 300 years ago, and especially when Washington was here 200 years ago. We're walking into the 1600 portion of the building. Where I'm standing right now was here in 1755. What's important about this area is the room just to my right, which was Major Andre's area. We called it the prison because he was held here during the Revolution. But of course, he wasn't locked up or chained up in any fashion. He took his meals with Alexander Hamilton, who lived upstairs for almost 2 years, and Talmadge, who was the head of Washington's spies. Some of you might have seen recently the series Turn, which is very it's not as factual as I would like, but it's important and germane to the history of the 76 House. Now, we're in the almost 400-year-old section of the restaurant. And what's very interesting about this, enjoy, Joe, is you have these massive beams overhead. These beams tell their own story because these beams are so large that they came from what was known as the King's Wood. Trees of this stature literally belonged to the king, and if you cut them down, it was a capital offense. So you know this is a pre-1700s building because these timbers were used to construct it. Smaller timbers and so on, you'll see in, residential buildings of the same era, and of course buildings after 1700, because it was illegal to actually have these timbers because, of course, the Europeans had cut down all the trees, and they needed this size wood to make masts, which is their equivalent of oil today, I suspect. Now, this fireplace tells a very large story. It's Delft tile. It's the original Delft tile. Tile came over in the bottoms of ships, and it was used as ballasts because these empty ships came to take all the resources of the colonies, and they needed something heavy to put in. So it was illegal to make bricks. And of course, glass and tile were like the fine goods almost that weighted these sailboats down so that they could sail. In front of this fire, Nathaniel Greene set up his headquarters. And of course, Washington, who dined here frequently, was here when a very important part of the Revolution happened. And that is the story of Major John Andre, who's on the left-hand side of the fireplace. And on the right-hand side, we have Washington's best friend, Benedict Arnold. Now, Washington was dining here when a courier walked in October of 1780 and handed Washington the plans of the West Point, which was actually back then called Fort Benedict Arnold. He would not believe that Benedict Arnold was a traitor until he opened those plans and saw the actual handwriting of his best friend Benedict Arnold. Got up from his table, walked over to the fireplace and turned the picture of Benedict Arnold upside down, and that's the original watercolor of Benedict Arnold that Washington turned upside down. It's now reframed in argon so it doesn't dissipate, but it tells a very large tale of a very important event in our history. 3 days after that picture was turned upside down, Major Andres marched in our front door and locked up in this little blue door behind me on the right. He's held here for 3 days, and after a very, it wasn't an orchestrated trial, but it was a trial that Washington definitely oversaw by having only the most circumspect, aristocratic colonists sit in court-martial of Major John Andre. After Major John Andre being faced with this jury of his peers, admitted to spying, Washington then used a different set of rules, the rules of war. And during wartime, if you professed the fact that you were spying, you could be executed, and not simply executed, but executed by hanging. So Washington, who is sometimes not given enough credit for his political acumen, he's often sometimes thought of as a blunt instrument. He was anything but that. He, in fact, orchestrated the eventual execution by hanging of a prominent and very well-liked aristocrat, Major John Andre, and his execution undermined the whole social structure of the colonies and reshaped our whole War of Independence. His hanging was very instrumental in Parliament's reason to stop funding the war against the colonials, one of the primary reasons that they gave. It is also important to note that if you were a Dutch settler of Rockland County now, but it was Orangetown prior, and of course Tappan, it was its capital, you really had a tough time with the taxational representation reason for getting involved in the revolution. It was more important to you now that you see an aristocrat being treated as a regular citizen, regular colonist, and now the war has meaning because now everybody is treated equally under the law. Washington has demonstrated that. So it was very important both overseas and domestically to perpetuate the War of Independence in October of 1780. Now, as the war slowly moved on, it was in this very room in 1783, early May 3rd, some say, but that Sir Guy Carleton and Washington met at the other side of this room, and historically had a very sumptuous meal together after 3 days of arguments at the DeWitt House, which is Washington's headquarters and the Masonic National Site to Washington. After 3 days of arguments over there, they gathered here, and Sir Guy Carleton handed Washington the plans of the British evacuation. And on behalf of the English, he recognized America as a free and independent nation. That's our Independence Day. And then the two of them got in a carriage together and went down to the waters off Piermont. It's now called, well, it was called Tappan by the Sea. It's now called Piermont because during the Second World War, they built a giant pier to accept the Liberty ships. For those of you who are interested in World War II history, that was Last Stop USA, and Tappan itself was where everybody was shipped to. The train, which goes right behind the back of the restaurant, went to Camp Shanks, where everybody was marshaled together, and then walked down Washington Street out through Tappan by the Sea, or Piermont, and onto these Liberty ships. So the largest amount of Americans, by far, who fought in the Second World War were staged here in Tappan and then shipped abroad. But getting back to our revolution, down on the shorelines of the Hudson, the sloop of war, the Vulture, which was the same boat that delivered Major Andre up the Hudson to meet with Benedict Arnold, saluted America with a 17-gun salute, officially recognizing America on the water as an independent nation, which in the 1700s was very important. So, where we're standing, the three most important things of our revolution actually happened. Our first separationist document, July 4th, 1774, the Orangetown Resolutions. Then, of course, the trial and eventual execution by hanging of Major John Andre, and the end of our War of Independence and the recognition of American independence from the English, May 3rd, 1780, all on these floorboards, which were hand-sanded during our most recent period of downtime, which was forced upon us. But I'm very proud of what we do here. This tavern, which is open 7 days a week, every day except Christmas Day, still functions in the same capacity that it was designed to do by the Dutch almost 400 years ago. This is where all of our friends and neighbors and political folks and so forth gather still today. And our job here is stewardship more than anything else. Keeping this beautiful edifice of American history alive is what I've devoted my life to, and I'm very proud to have done it. And I thank you for watching this impromptu history and 76 house video, and I hope you come and try some of our Tavernkeeper Ale and a great meal, and it's my pleasure to be your host, hopefully for a few more years. Thank you.